Okay. Well, thank you again for being here. It's a pleasure to join you on this important summit. The title of my presentation today is "Are We Prepared for Mass Climate Migration? A Coherent Framework for Resilience and Justice." Here's where I'd like to start our conversation. The concept of environmental and climate refugees. And a lot of people have heard these phrases, and frequently, unfortunately, the references to something that might happen in several decades with the impact of climate change. I'd like to argue that this is already happening, and that the acceleration of environmental and climate refugees on the African continent has already begun. And in the next decade or two, we're going to reach unsustainable and dangerous levels of displacement. So climate refugees are a subset of environmental refugees. Environmental refugees are people forced to move because of natural disasters. But climate refugees are people displaced by climate change, droughts, floods, storms, sea level rising, and so on. In 2009, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees reported that 36 million people were displaced by natural disasters. This is 2009. This is more than a decade ago. Most scientists estimate that the number will be at least 50 million and possibly as high as 200 million by 2050. And a lot of the displacement will actually be happening on the African continent. May I please ask for the microphones to be muted in the background? Thank you. A huge driver of this climate change that we're dealing with right now are fossil fuels. And I would like to invite all of us to take a look at fossilfueltreaty.org, which is an international initiative calling on all countries to work within the UN system to negotiate a treaty to phase out fossil fuels on a rapid schedule with just transition for workers in the fossil fuel industry, for countries that depend on fossil fuel exports, and countries that depend on fossil fuels for energy production. This graph that you're looking at here is called the production gap, and it's from a report published a couple of years ago by the United Nations Environmental Program called the production gap. And the gap is very clear. It's the gap between how much countries are how much countries are planning to extract and burn by 2030 and 2040 versus how much we're allowed to extract and burn if we are going to meet the climate challenge and keep the planet from exceeding the 1.5 degree limit. Right now, we're on track to extract and burn almost twice as much as we're allowed by 2030, and almost 4 times as much by 2040. And 2030 and 2040, to be honest, when it comes to climate change, we're talking about the day after tomorrow. So our only choice is to rapidly phase out fossil fuels and to end the construction of additional fossil fuel infrastructure, starting with coal, but also including oil and natural gas. A few data points to keep in mind. This is water stress around the globe. As you can see, most of the regions that experience high levels of stress are in Africa and in the Middle East. Of course, this map is a little bit outdated, and all of us know the extent to which water stress has been hitting the African continent in the last few years. This is a study called Groundswell by the World Bank, and this report looks at displacement of people because of climate change in different parts of the world. Sub-Saharan Africa will experience the displacement of 86 million people by 2050. North Africa will experience 19 million people being displaced because of climate change by 2050. The question is, if we're not stopping climate change, are we prepared for this mass migration of people? Are we prepared economically? I'm an economist, so I'll focus on this aspect. Economically, meaning when millions of people are displaced and are moving to new locations, do we have housing? Do we have the food? Do we have the logistics, the schools, the healthcare, the transportation, the employment opportunities for everyone to be able to live with dignity because of this displacement? That is the question that we're dealing with. So this World Bank projection, they're really looking at internal climate migrants by 2050. This is not cross-border, and we know that internal displacement is the first step for social, economic, political tension, and very often that sparks internal conflicts, sometimes cross-border conflicts. So this is really a very dangerous set of projections that we have to take very, very seriously. So looking at different regions in the world, if you focus on sub-Saharan Africa, you have here three sets of scenarios, and I can go back here for a second and show you the scenarios. The yellow scenario is the most pessimistic scenario. The green scenario is the more climate-friendly scenario, meaning if we actually take significant climate action around the world in the next few years. And the mid-level scenario is a scenario where we put in place some inclusive development strategies in the next few years. So pessimistic and optimistic and middle-of-the-road type of scenarios. That's what we're looking at. And as you can see, sub-Saharan Africa is the most affected region, according to this forecast, with more than 70 million people displaced in the pessimistic scenario, and at least close to 30 million people being displaced in sub-Saharan Africa, according to the most optimistic scenario, meaning the most aggressive climate action that we're supposed to take is still going to result into close to 30 million people being displaced in sub-Saharan Africa, and close to 5 million people being displaced in North Africa. As I said earlier, this displacement has already started. So zooming in on North Africa in particular, these are the areas that are projected to have high climate in-migration and out-migration by 2030. Let me remind you, this is December 2022. So 2030 is in less than 8 years as we speak. And a lot of this movement has already begun. So when you look at the dark spots there, the darker, the more intense the movement of people. Notice this map right here is the projection for 2030. I'm going to click on the next button. It's going to show us the 2050 estimates, and they just get more intense and darker. So the question about these regions that are welcoming new migrants because of climate events and climate displacement, people losing their livelihood and having to essentially migrate completely to new areas, are those areas being prepared with infrastructure, transportation, housing, health, schools, everything needed to create jobs for these new families, millions of people that will be displaced? And the answer is unfortunately not. We're not preparing for any of this mass migration of people. So a global perspective on this, of course, there's the issue of inequality, not just on the continent, but global inequality. When you look at the richest 10% of the global income distribution, controlling 52% of global wealth. And then I map this against the CO2 emissions based on wealth distribution, and the picture is very similar. It looks like the richest 10% are responsible for almost half of total CO2 emissions. So we have an inequality crisis that's been overlaid over the climate crisis. So we have to address these things simultaneously. And when you look at the global trade and finance architecture. This picture is what I describe as the NeoColonial net wealth extraction. And what this picture does, I'll explain it in very simple terms. If you divide the world in two groups, rich countries and poor countries, let's call them Global South and Global North. What this picture shows us, the green line shows us, is that on an annual basis, the richest countries on the planet are extracting $2 trillion a year from the Global South, meaning money is moving from the poorest countries in the Global South to the richest countries on the planet at the tune of $2 trillion. And this is net transfers, meaning this takes into account exports, imports, interest payments, loans, charity, debt cancellation, foreign direct investment, all the remittances, all the global transactions. When we net out all the global flows, we find that the poorest countries are losing $2 trillion to the richest countries. And notice this green line has been accelerating over the last couple of decades. So if we don't do anything to change the extractive nature of the global financial architecture, this $2 trillion in a few years will be $4, 5, 7, $10 trillion, and will continue this neo-colonial extraction of wealth from the Global South. A lot of it obviously comes from the African continent. So the question is, are we, as countries, are we prepared to accommodate this mass climate migration from an economic standpoint in terms of infrastructure? And can we actually afford this? Do we have the fiscal capacity to pay for it without causing inflation and without bankrupting nations? So again, this is my area of expertise as an economist, is to answer this question. How do we pay for large-scale transformative policies without causing inflation, without bankrupting countries, without adding to the external debt crisis that most developing countries have, and so on? So this is where this concept of monetary sovereignty becomes very important starting point for our analysis. So I talk about the spectrum of monetary sovereignty. Not all sovereign nations have the same degree of monetary sovereignty. Some countries have limited or no monetary sovereignty at all. Some countries have a very high degree of monetary sovereignty. So high degree of monetary sovereignty, I can place countries like the US, Japan, Canada, and so on this end of the spectrum. Countries with no monetary sovereignty whatsoever, meaning countries that can't even issue their own currency, national currency. A good example would be countries in the CFA zone, the French colonial currency, which still persists to this day. That would be an example of countries that don't have any monetary sovereignty. Most African countries, to be honest, are in this area that I described as countries with limited degree of monetary sovereignty. So what determines where you sit as a country on this spectrum is the level of external debt that a country accumulates. And when I say external debt, it's debt denominated in foreign currencies, dollars and euros and so on. Debt denominated in a national currency is something that we can manage, and I can talk about that later during the Q&A session. So I'll focus here on the external debt factor that really limits the fiscal capacity of our countries to address climate change, public health, investment in education, all kinds of things. So that's what determines the fiscal policy space. And the more external debt a country has, the more desperate it becomes to fix its exchange rate to foreign currencies like the dollar or the euro. So the issue of fixed exchange rate also is problematic here, and I'll come back to it in a minute. So that's really the starting point. We want to talk about how can we take countries with limited degree of monetary sovereignty on this end of the spectrum and introduce strategic transformative policies that gradually allow us to move higher and higher and higher on this spectrum of monetary sovereignty. So monetary sovereignty is not something that you declare by decree, by presidential decree. It's something that you acquire, something that you earn with strategic investments and long-term transformative policies. So that's really the goal here, is how do we introduce these strategic policies to acquire this higher degree of monetary sovereignty that actually allows us to pay for the infrastructure needed to allow climate migrants across the continent to have the resources they need and have a decent life with dignity in this new environment that we're having to deal with. So that's the starting point. So typically, most economists, mainstream economists and mainstream thinkers tell us, well, if you want to think about how much we can spend safely without causing inflation, they say the limits to government spending should be tax revenues and a little bit of borrowing from the private sector, whatever the market allows you to borrow. Other than that, we're told that there's really not much governments can do. We need to rely on foreign aid, we need to rely on the private sector, and so on. But what I'm suggesting here is that there's this additional fiscal spending capacity, this bright yellow space, that's not infinite. Notice it's not unlimited. It's constrained by that red bar, the inflation risk. So then how do we, number one, determine how much fiscal capacity we have, that additional bright yellow space, and how do we determine the actual drivers of that inflation risk so we can mitigate the risk of inflation, and so that we can introduce strategies to allow us to broaden and expand this additional spending capacity. That's really the key economic question here that will allow us to deal with climate migration, to deal with climate change, to do the strategic investments that are needed to mitigate the impact of climate change on the African continent. So the real limit to government spending is the risk of inflation. And for me, the risk of inflation is determined by two factors. Number one, the lack of productive capacity, logistics, supply chain disruptions, and so on. In other words, if we invest in building additional productive capacity in housing, in electricity production, in water treatment, and so on, in healthcare infrastructure, then we can spend more without causing inflation. We'll be pushing the risk of inflation further out. So that's the real limit. The good news here is that this additional productive capacity is producible. So the more we invest in these strategic areas such as housing, energy, food, transportation, the less inflation risk emerges. And the good news is that we create millions of jobs in this process and we push the risk of inflation. But the second aspect of this inflation risk is what I call abusive market power and price setting behavior. That is to say, when you have key players in the economy who can raise prices simply because they can, or because we let them, because we're not regulating the market properly, then this kind of abusive price setting behavior will cause inflation. So how do we deal with this kind of inflation risk? Not by spending less and neglecting people and throwing people under the bus, so to speak, but we deal with this abusive market power by taxing and regulating their market power out of existence. In other words, introducing regulations that make the market more competitive, as opposed to allowing monopolies and oligopolies and cartels to dominate and abuse the market. So if we're successful at doing both, increasing the productive capacity of our economies, and number two, taxing and regulating abusive market power, we're actually able to expand this additional spending capacity. In other words, allowing the government to spend more and doing so safely without causing inflation, without bankrupting the country, without negative economic consequences. So that is really the exercise, that is really the paradigm shift that I'm suggesting here. Instead of saying austerity is the way to keep governments disciplined and prevent inflation, here I'm saying it's strategic investments in regulation, in taxation that allows us to expand the government spending capacity, eliminate the risk of inflation, and actually deal with the national priorities on the infrastructural level so that we can mitigate the impact of mass climate migration over the next few years. So it's important here when we talk about these strategic investments to recognize where the investments need to go, and which means we need to understand what are the structural weaknesses that our countries have. And here I'm talking about the African continent, but really the global South in general struggles with the same structural weaknesses. And I'll give some examples. Structural trade deficits that lead to high levels of external debt. Again, external debt means debt denominated in foreign currencies, dollars and euros. So the major root causes of this structural trade deficit are three areas: food deficits, energy deficits, and low value added industrialization. I'll explain each one point by point. Energy deficit, here I'm talking about even countries like Nigeria, who are major producers of fossil fuels, petroleum in particular, but Nigeria imports its gasoline. So you export the raw material, crude oil, and then you import the higher value added content, the refined petrochemicals, the gasoline and kerosene and other petrochemicals. So you're always losing in that trade because you're exporting the raw material, you're importing the more processed and expensive final product. On the food front, the African continent as a whole today imports 85% of its food, which is insane. The richest soil on the planet, the most fertile soil on the planet, and yet we're dependent on food imports. When during colonial times, the African continent was a net exporter to the global north. But of course, after independence, the global north as a whole, that is the European Union, the United States, Canada, Australia, and so on, all of these countries, including the Soviet Union at the time, introduced agricultural policies and agricultural subsidies to eliminate competition from the global south, and they've succeeded starting in the 1960s. And that's why today Africa imports 85% of its food. So we need to address this particular deficiency on the food front, on the energy front. And then finally, the low value added industrialization means that the type of industrialization we've built in the global south is an industrialization that relies on assembly line type of manufacturing or simply extractive industries like mining. In other words, you import the capital, you import the fuel, you import the intermediate components, the technology, and we use low-cost labor to assemble, and as a result, contribute only a very small amount of value added to the final product. So when you're exporting low value added materials, but you're importing high value added material, you're always stuck in that trap. So you add these three deficiencies, energy, food, and value added of industrialization, you realize that our countries have a structural trade deficit. That's what structural trade deficit, which means it's persistent if you don't change strategies. And the structural trade deficit results in downward pressure on your exchange rate. In other words, the value of our currency will fall relative to the dollar. This is what we call currency devaluation or currency depreciation. So when our currency is cheaper relative to the dollar and the euro, everything we import the next morning will be more expensive, whether we're importing food or medicine or fuel. So everything you import is more expensive, meaning we're importing inflation. We have food and fuel price inflation. You will have social unrest under these conditions, which forces our governments, therefore, to intervene immediately, typically with band-aid solutions in the form of food and fuel subsidies that over time become burdensome on the state. And number two, it forces the central bank to intervene in order to artificially fix the exchange rate. So this is where fixing the exchange rate becomes critical. The central bank fixes the interest rate, the exchange rate at an artificially higher level in order to protect and insulate our economy from the imported inflation. So how does the central bank fix the exchange rate? The central bank does it by borrowing dollars and euros, and as a result, accelerating the external debt trap. So these are the structural problems that we must address in order for us to create the monetary sovereignty, the fiscal policy sovereignty, so that we can spend safely without causing inflation, without accelerating this debt problem, external debt problem, and so that we can actually mitigate the impact of climate change and build the infrastructure, the public services needed, the housing, the schooling, the jobs that are needed to deal with this mass migration crisis that is unfolding before our eyes. So the problem with the mainstream solutions that are being proposed, the mainstream solutions that have been used from the early days of independence, which I call really the continuation of colonial policies, as in neocolonial policies. The mainstream approach tells us austerity. Well, austerity means the government spends less, which means the government will not be able to mitigate the impact of climate change. The government will not be able to mitigate the substantial investments that are needed to mitigate climate change. So debt restructuring, we're told that we need to stretch out the loans over a longer time period. Privatize state-owned enterprises. These are typical policies, by the way, imposed by the IMF and the World Bank with the conditionalities of their loan. Privatizing state companies, meaning you sell them to the private sector, typically to foreign investors. You earn a few $100 million, you spend them in a few years, and then you're back to square one, because structurally you have that structural trade deficit I described. We're told we need more labor market flexibility, meaning crush labor unions and lower wages and lower working conditions. Again, it's a trap. Foreign direct investment and export-led growth again produces this negative terms of trade, because we tend to specialize in assembly line type of manufacturing or extractive industries. So the more you accelerate your exports, the more you end up importing capital and fuel and intermediate goods. So you're always stuck in that trap unless you introduce industrial policies that allow us to climb up the ladder, so to speak, of the value chain. Financial liberalization, that is to say, open up your financial markets, your banking system to foreign investors. Well, the problem with this, as we've seen in South Africa, as we've seen in South Korea and Mexico and Brazil and Russia and Turkey and all the countries, emerging countries that open up their financial markets, you end up with this speculative bubble, that is speculators who are coming in to buy low and sell high. So initially you have a little bit of a boom in your stock market, a little bit of a boom in the value of your currency, but as soon as they realize you've hit the peak, they will sell in your stock market, so you end up with the stock market crash, and then they will sell your currency and leave, and as a result you have a currency crash, and typically 10 years worth of recovery to go back to where you were pre-crisis. Not a good solution. Tourism, and I'd like to emphasize tourism here for most of the countries on the African continent and the global south in general. Tourism appears to be a solution because you bring millions of tourists, they bring dollars and euros, and they create millions of jobs on the continent for transportation and hotels and entertainment and restaurants and so on. So it appears to be a great solution for economic development and for revenue generation, but it's a false solution when you don't have food sovereignty, when you don't have energy sovereignty. The millions of tourists that you bring in, you have to feed them, so you end up importing even more food that you don't have, and you have to house them and transport them and heat and cool the hotels for them, so you end up importing even more energy to serve the tourism industry. So the net impact of tourism is actually negative from a financial perspective for those countries, because if you take into account how much additional food imports and energy imports and capital imports is needed to serve the tourism industry, you end up not breaking even, you end up in most cases actually losing money. But if you have food sovereignty, if you have energy sovereignty, then yes, tourism can be a net benefit from a financial perspective. There's, of course, the resource sustainability factor here that must be taken into account. Remittances. We're told that Africans working in Europe, the United States, and other parts of the global north who send money back home are contributing a major economic factor to the development of the global south, of the African continent. From a financial perspective, yes, in the narrowest sense of the term, but let's not forget the massive brain drain that the continent struggles from. So from a broader financial perspective, the continent and the global south in general is actually losing from a remittances perspective, because we're talking about developing countries that invest a substantial amount in health and education and infrastructure to produce young people who are ready to be productive members of society, innovators, investors, developers, and then we ship them abroad as a gift to the global north to contribute to their economies primarily, with a little bit of remittances coming back to home countries. It's not a good deal for Africa. It's not a good deal for the global south. As a result, it's not a solution to these traps. So we end up with a race to the bottom, where the countries on the African continent and the global south competing and racing to the bottom to lower the cost for tourism, to lower the cost of labor, to lower environmental standards, regulatory standards, and financial markets, and so on, to attract as much as we can of these false solutions that end up hurting our economies collectively overall. So we end up with keeping the structural problems and more external debt, and we're told that there is no alternative. Like Margaret Thatcher said in the 1980s, there's no alternative to the austerity model, to the mainstream perspective. And I argue that this is precisely the trap that we must undo if we're serious about having the fiscal capacity to address this mass climate migration that is unfolding before our eyes. I'm zooming in on one country just to show you as an example what's going on here. If you look at Ghana's exports, notice the composition of their exports, and notice the dollar amount. This is for 2019, so it's pre-COVID. You have $25 billion worth of exports, and then I'm flipping the picture next to the import, $27 billion worth of import. So there you go, you have that structural trade deficit, and notice the complexity of the products that a country like Ghana exports and imports. We have that all of those structural weaknesses are displayed here. You have mostly raw materials that are being exported, extractive industries, and then more sophisticated products that are being imported. So the value-added content of what we export and what we import, there's a huge difference here. So back to that spectrum of monetary sovereignty, how do we transition to higher degrees of sovereignty? The global south, a quick summary: we have low degree of monetary sovereignty. We're not responsible for climate change. Africa as a continent emits as a whole the same amount as the country of Spain alone. We're responsible for a tiny fraction of global cumulative emissions since the Industrial Revolution. So the global south is not responsible for climate change. We struggle with high levels of external debt because of these neocolonial traps that I described. We have low levels of productive capacity, low capacity for research and development, and we suffer from these neocolonial extractive economic conditions. On the other hand, the global north enjoys a very high degree of monetary sovereignty. The global north is responsible for climate change. Let's call it climate debt, to be more precise. Has low to no external debt to speak of. Here again, I'm not talking about domestic debt and domestic currencies, but external debt. The global north has high levels of productive capacity, high levels of research and development capacity, and benefits from this neocolonial extractive economic system. So when you map out these two conditions here, the only way to repair the damage of this colonial and neocolonial extractive and climate extractive system is to introduce a framework for reparations for the economic damage of colonialism and neocolonialism, and reparations for climate debt, which the global South suffers from the most. We're talking about mass climate migration that's caused by climate change, which is the responsibility of the global North. And yet we're saying that African countries have to somehow figure out their finances to pay for this massive, burdensome cost of climate mitigation without reparations. So I don't see any way out forward here without reparations. And finally, I want to say a few words about the importance of developing a coherent Pan-African industrial strategy that will allow us to build the infrastructure for electricity production, for transportation, for housing, and so on. I'll argue that it's very difficult to do this country by country. We have to have South-South strategic partnerships on the African continent and the global South as a whole, with some partnership with member countries of the global North as needed, but partners on equal terms, not partners as in neocolonial extractive hierarchical relationships. So the importance of this industrial policy on a Pan-African level is the following. When you have a large block of countries forming a common market and common industrial policies, you allow your industries to hit these economies of scale. Because with a small country, you can't really produce a large volume and lower the cost per unit unless you have access to large international markets. Our problem is that the large international markets are dominated by multinational corporations and countries in the global North. And if we do that, we will continue to be building products to serve the needs of the global North when we have urgent needs on the African continent. So a Pan-African strategy for a Pan-African common market means we can allow our economies to hit those economies of scale. And you leverage the complementarity of resources and capabilities across the country. So not every country has all the resources and all the capabilities, but as a bloc, as a continent, we have all the resources needed, for example, to produce renewable energy. We have all the resources needed to industrialize the raw materials. But how are we using them today? We're shipping them to the global North to serve the needs of the rest of the planet. And we're neglecting, for example, the 600 million Africans today who have no access to electricity. That has to change. And then this Pan-African industrial strategy allows us to create what economists call these horizontal linkages to increase the creation of value added and the retention of value added from manufacturing on the African continent. And that's really how you industrialize. You need to create linkages between industries within your trading bloc. Whereas right now, we extract and ship for industries to produce somewhere else, and we don't retain and we don't leverage value added in our industries on the continent. So these are the basic terms for this Pan-African industrial policy. And we focus on our collective resilience. We start with the areas that matter to those structural traps. We prioritize investments in food sovereignty, renewable energy sovereignty, water security, education, healthcare, transportation. These are the basic pillars of a prosperous economy and prosperous society. And we have to put this at the center of our strategy. And this is how a country or a region acquires a high degree of economic and monetary sovereignty over time. And I would argue that if a country or regional bloc lacks this basic level of resilience, it has no bargaining chips, it can't walk away from a negotiation table, and it will continue to lose its economic and monetary sovereignty over time. So this is vital for the African continent, for the global South in general. This is vital if we're serious about mitigating the impact of climate change and dealing with this mass climate migration that has already begun, and it will continue to accelerate. I'll just close with just one thought, because this just popped up again on the radar screen. The idea of a TransAfrican highway system that's been in place as an idea since the 1970s and never been achieved, because we're not going to have a Pan-African industrial policy if we literally don't have a transportation system on the African continent. So the idea from the 1970s is to build a highway system, and I applaud the idea and so on, but it's very important for us today to think bigger than highway and more strategically than highways. We need to use a Pan-African industrial manufacturing strategy to manufacture and produce the transportation infrastructure on the continent rather than import it. And if we're investing in highways, especially in this moment in the history of the world, the global north is in the process of decarbonizing its streets, and it will be dumping its fossil fuel-based automobiles, used cars, in the African continent. And they will encourage actually the construction of roads and highways to facilitate the dumping of the fossil fuel cars on the African continent. I would suggest that we replace this plan for a highway system with a strategic industrial policy for high-speed trains manufactured on the African continent. We have all the raw materials needed. We have all the human capabilities needed. Maybe we need to partner on the technological front with partners from outside the continent. It could be Germany, it could be Japan, it could be China. It doesn't matter which particular country, as long as we partner on equal terms on the technological front to serve the needs of the African economy. So just a note, because this just came back on the radar screen, the African Development Bank is looking at restarting the discussions and the plans for TransAfrican highway system. I think we need to think bigger and more strategically. And finally, to conclude, we have less than 10 years to go, really, to tackle this based on all the numbers that we have, and the numbers are getting worse every year. The climate crisis, the inequality, poverty, exclusion, and injustice, all of these crises call for urgent and bold and transformative actions, not small incremental solutions. The current climate policies, jobs policies, are too weak, too slow, too expensive, and ineffective. And that means the overall situation becomes more and more dangerous. So preparing countries for mass climate migration requires a fundamental restructuring of the global economic architecture in the way that I described today. And what I call a global Green New Deal with climate and colonial reparations is actually possible, desirable, and affordable. Thank you very much. I'll stop here, and I'm happy to take questions from the audience. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Professor Fadhel Kaboub from Denison University, Ohio. It was a wonderful presentation, and we cannot expect you to do less. I saw you when you did this in the US, and I said, yes, you must come and replicate it on our continent. We are not disappointed. We are highly impressed. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Okay, you want to say something?
Oh, I said my pleasure. Thank you so much. I'm happy to take questions.
Yes, as a guide, before we set the floor open for people who want to ask questions, I specifically want those of us who are journalists to please let this message sink into our hearts that Africa as a continent, we must push in our respective country at the level of African Union to ensure that we restructure the trade deficit on this continent to lead us into power sovereignty, monetary sovereignty, and food sovereignty. And from the lecture delivered there today, we have been told that the tourism sector, which is very key to Africa in generating more revenue, cannot be self-sustainable if we don't actually evolve the African transportation system, which will be the hub of industrialization in Africa. We must address the issues of poverty, inequality, exclusion, and injustice on climate matters. So we must be guided by all these recommendations. I must thank you once again, Professor. So the floor is now open for everyone who has questions. And if Dr. Willem is also ready to also help us to paraphrase what has been discussed here in French, the floor is open. So who goes first? We are ready. Please raise up your hand if you want to indicate by raising up your hand so that we can let you have the floor. Okay, I can see the hand of Dr. Okanse. Dr. Okanse, you have the floor. Please go ahead.
Professor, I sincerely want to thank you for this eye-opener of this climate injustice that has been going on for years on our continent.
Thank you.
As a member of the African Union Labor Migration Advisory Committee, I have to be honest to say that implementation has been our weakest point. And I like the point that you make about the regional communities. I would actually like to ask Dr. Ajibola, this would be good for us to look at bringing to either the ECOWAS or the EAC or whichever one of the regional communities. I believe that this presentation must travel our various community, our various regional communities. Maybe we can do something. I can arrange for us to do something at the African Union. But again, for me, it's not about it's more about implementation. Implementation, right. And perhaps the way he's laid it out makes it very clear for everyone to understand. And I believe that once the regional communities get it, then we can collectively now bring it to the African Union for it to move forward to where it needs to be. This particular presentation, if implemented, can save this continent and create that shift that we have all been looking for. And for me, 2063 is too far. That journey needs to start right now. Again, Professor, I applaud the effort, and we on this second African Migration Summit, we're very interested in working with you to see how we can get this message across the continent. Thank you once
again. Thank you again for your kind words. And as I always say in these contexts, name the time and place when our policymakers and our leaders are ready to engage in these conversations, and I'll be there via Zoom or in person as needed, because this is so important for all of us on the planet, but in particular for the African continent, for the global South, and on the climate front. And I truly believe that all of these solutions are within reach. We just have to think very clearly and strategically and think long term. And this is something I didn't say in the presentation, and I need to say here, because the world is changing before our eyes as we speak. We've gone through three major crises in the last decade: the 2008 financial crisis, the COVID crisis, and the Ukraine crisis. All of these have completely transformed the geopolitical and economic map of the world. And I see three major economic blocks emerging in this new form of globalization: a Western European bloc dominated by the European Union, a North American bloc dominated by the United States, obviously, and an Asian bloc dominated by China and its allies in the region and its influence in Central Asia and so on, possibly all the way to Russia. So where is Africa in this new global economic map and geopolitical map? All three major blocs are building their own sovereignty. The Europeans are talking about technological sovereignty, food sovereignty, energy sovereignty, so that they insulate and build resilience internally. The Americans are doing the same, and China, of course, is doing the same via its Belt and Road Initiative. The plan from these three blocs is for Africa to continue to be the place for cheap raw materials, to be the place where they dump their surplus output, their manufacturing, and to be the place for low-cost assembly line manufacturing for industries that they want to outsource that they don't need. So it's very important to recognize that all of the major players on the planet, they have long-term strategic visions for themselves. And I'm talking about countries that think 50 to 100 years ahead. We on the African continent and the global South in particular, we tend to think towards the end of the month. Are we able to pay the salaries? Are we able to import the food? Are we able to keep people, housed by the end of the month? So we need to get out of this short-term perspective and really get into a coherent Pan-African strategy so we can place the African continent on this new global economic map in a non-extractive economic system, in a non-neocolonial economic system, because the rest of the world still perceives and counts on us to sit and remain in that position. And that is not going to be a pleasant life for our children and grandchildren moving forward on this planet. So our African leaders at the African Union level, we need to be thinking 2063 and beyond, but we have to take strategic action today to transform our economies, to transform our geopolitical position on the planet. And here I remind everybody of Prime Minister Mia Mottley from Barbados, who always repeats this important line that emerged out of the Barbadian independence movement with the first prime minister at the time in the 60s, who said, "Friends of all, satellites of none," which means we'll cooperate with all of our friends across the world, whether it's China, the US, Germany, it doesn't matter, but we will not be a satellite country or satellite region for the rest of the global north to use and abuse us and our resources. So that phrase, friends of all, satellites of none, has to be the guiding principle of how we reposition ourselves on the global economic and geopolitical map, and finally decolonize our economic policies and our economies.
Thank you so much, Prof.